the bells of Blackstone Castle rang across the valley, announcing the return of Duke Albert, the kingdom's youngest war hero. Soldiers lined the road with polished armor, banners snapped proudly in the autumn wind, and nobles hurried to the palace courtyard, eager to greet the man whose victories had expanded the duchy's borders and earned the king's highest praise. Servants rushed through marble halls carrying silver trays and expensive wine, preparing a celebration worthy of the famous commander. Everyone smiled with excitement, believing the castle had finally come alive again. Everyone except the young woman standing quietly inside the palace kitchen. Alexandra, only 22 years old, carefully stirred a pot of herb soup over a gentle fire while fresh bread baked nearby. She had dismissed the cook's hours earlier, insisting on preparing the meal herself. It had become a ritual she refused to abandon, no matter how many evenings ended with untouched plates and fading candlelight. She arranged every dish with care, placed Albert's favorite roasted pheasant at the center of the table, and folded a linen napkin exactly the way she had learned during their first year of marriage. Hope, she had discovered, could survive almost anything except certainty. When the great gates finally opened, Albert rode into the courtyard beneath thunderous cheers. At 25, he looked every bit the legendary commander the kingdom admired. His black cloak flowed behind him, his armor carried fresh scratches from distant battlefields, and his expression remained as unreadable as carved stone. He acknowledged the crowd with a brief nod before handing his horse to a stable boy. Ministers hurried to surround him with reports, generals congratulated him, and noble women admired him from behind jeweled fans. Albert accepted every greeting with calm efficiency, never lingering long enough for warmth to interrupt duty. Alexandra watched unseen from a nearby window. A gentle smile crossed her face simply because he had returned safely. That single fact was enough to quiet months of worry. She hurried to the dining room, lit the candles, and waited beside the table as footsteps echoed through the corridor. The door opened. Albert entered without looking around. Dust from the road still covered his boots as he removed his gloves. "Welcome home," Alexandra said softly. He paused for only a heartbeat. "Thank you." Nothing more. A minister appeared behind him carrying documents requiring immediate signatures. Albert followed the man without another glance, leaving the dining room before the food had begun to cool. Alexandra remained standing where she was until the silence settled around her once again. Then she quietly sat alone and ate dinner across from the empty chair reserved for her husband. It had not always surprised her. On their wedding night, beneath crystal chandeliers and endless applause, she had believed she was beginning a life beside a man she could one day love. Instead, after the final guests departed, Albert had stood near the window and spoken with calm honesty. "This marriage protects our families and strengthens the duchy," he had said. "Please don't mistake it for love." Before she found words to answer, he had gathered a few belongings and moved into another wing of the palace. She cried until sunrise, though no one heard her. 3 years later, little had changed. Albert spent most of each year leading campaigns or attending royal councils. Whenever he returned, his days filled with meetings, military reports, and political banquets. Alexandra became little more than a courteous shadow walking the same halls. The palace noticed. "So young," one countess whispered during an afternoon tea. "Married, yet still living like a widow." Another laughed behind her fan. "I almost forget the Duke has a wife." The comments spread through every corridor. Servants lowered their voices whenever Alexandra approached. Some pitied her. Others mocked her quiet patience. Even ministers ignored requests carrying her seal, believing the Duke would never ask whether his wife had been obeyed. Albert never heard the whispers. Or perhaps he never noticed them. Still, Alexandra refused bitterness. Each morning before sunrise, wearing an ordinary gray cloak instead of embroidered silk, she slipped through a small servant's gate with only her elderly maid, Martha. Together they visited orphanages where hungry children greeted Alexandra like an older sister. She brought warm bread, blankets, medicine, and storybooks purchased by selling another piece of her jewelry. She quietly paid widows' debts, helped rebuild cottages destroyed by fire, and sat beside wounded veterans until nightmares finally surrendered to sleep. No statues honored her kindness. No songs carried her name. She asked only that every gift remain anonymous. By evening she returned before Albert noticed she had ever left. Whenever another necklace disappeared from her collection, the palace assumed changing fashions explained its absence. No one guessed she was slowly exchanging every treasure she owned for someone else's tomorrow. That night, after clearing away another untouched dinner, Alexandra entered her small sitting room and unlocked an old wooden chest. Inside lay dozens of carefully folded letters tied with pale blue ribbons. She took fresh paper, dipped her pen into ink, and began writing. My dear Albert, today I met a little boy who reminded me that hope survives even when people forget to look for it. She filled several pages before gently folding them. Like every letter before it, the final line remained unchanged. I'll wait for you tomorrow. She placed the newest letter inside the growing chest, closed the lid, rested her trembling hand upon the weathered wood, and stared toward the dark window, wondering for the first time how many tomorrows a faithful heart could survive. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected, covering the duchy in relentless frost and leaving fields barren beneath sheets of ice. Harvests failed across the countryside, rivers froze before merchants could deliver grain, and frightened families watched their food stores disappear one meal at a time. While desperate villagers searched for bread, Duke Albert remained hundreds of miles away leading another military campaign for the crown. Every victory he claimed earned celebrations in the capital, yet back home the people he ruled fought a quieter battle against hunger, illness, and despair. The council assured neighboring nobles that everything remained under control, but Alexandra knew better. Every morning frightened mothers gathered outside the castle gates carrying pale children wrapped in worn blankets. Elderly farmers arrived with trembling hands, begging for seed they could never afford. Veterans who had once fought proudly beneath Albert's banner stood silently in line, ashamed to ask for food after sacrificing everything for their homeland. Alexandra listened to every story because she understood that ignoring suffering was often more painful than suffering itself. The treasury contained enough wealth to ease the crisis, yet several ministers insisted it should remain untouched until the Duke returned. They feared appearing weak before rival territories far more than they feared starving villagers. Their polished speeches disguised selfish intentions, and Alexandra recognized greed behind every careful excuse. Since official permission would never come, she quietly decided that compassion could not wait for politics. She ordered the abandoned eastern granaries reopened under the cover of night and hired trusted workers to distribute food without revealing its source. Merchant caravans arriving from distant provinces found generous payments waiting before they unloaded grain into empty storehouses. Alexandra sold another necklace, then another bracelet, until nearly every jewel she had received on her wedding day had vanished into bags of wheat, medicine, blankets, and firewood. The palace noticed her simpler clothing, but no one imagined the fortune she had exchanged for strangers who would never know her name. As the weeks passed, soup kitchens appeared in villages that had never possessed one before. Traveling physicians received horses, supplies, and warm clothing. Schools remained open because Alexandra secretly paid every teacher's wages. She convinced wealthy landowners to forgive overdue rents and quietly covered their losses herself. Whenever families thanked anonymous benefactors, she smiled from a distance and continued walking before anyone recognized the Duchess beneath her plain cloak. The people gradually survived the bitter season, while every official report praised Duke Albert's wise leadership for preserving order despite the famine. Alexandra never corrected the misunderstanding. She believed saving lives mattered more than receiving credit, even when every compliment directed toward Albert echoed with sacrifices only she understood. One quiet morning, as snow melted beneath the first gentle sunlight of spring, the castle physician entered her chambers carrying unexpected news. After completing his examination, he bowed with a rare smile. "Your Grace," he said softly, "you are going to have a child." For a long moment, Alexandra simply covered her mouth as joyful tears blurred her vision. She imagined Albert holding their baby, perhaps smiling for the first time without restraint. She hurried to her writing desk and began a letter filled with excitement, describing hopes she had never dared speak aloud. Halfway through the page, her pen stopped. No, she decided. She wanted to tell him herself when he finally came home. She folded the unfinished letter and placed it beside the others inside the wooden chest. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Albert's messages continued arriving from distant battlefields, each describing captured fortresses, troop movements, and political negotiations. None asked how she felt. None mentioned returning soon. Alexandra read every letter twice before carefully storing them away, refusing to let disappointment harden into resentment. Then the spring rains came. Mountain rivers overflowed, swallowing bridges, homes, and entire villages within hours. Without hesitation, Alexandra mounted her horse and joined rescue workers pulling frightened families from rising floodwaters. She carried children across collapsed roads, distributed supplies through freezing rain, and refused to leave until every survivor reached safety. On the third exhausting day, while helping lift heavy timber from a trapped family, sharp pain spread through her body. Darkness swallowed the world. When Alexandra opened her eyes again, she lay inside the castle infirmary. Beside her sat the elderly nurse Eleanor, whose reddened eyes revealed the truth before words could. "I'm so sorry," the nurse whispered. "We couldn't save the baby." Silence settled over the room with unbearable weight. Alexandra closed her eyes, allowing tears to fall without restraint. No angry cry escaped her lips. No accusation filled the air. Only the quiet grief of a mother mourning someone she had loved before ever meeting. That evening she dismissed everyone, unlocked the familiar wooden chest, and removed fresh paper. Her trembling hand struggled to guide the pen across the page. "Today our little one left before meeting you." She folded the letter around a pair of tiny knitted baby shoes she had finished only days earlier. After placing both carefully inside the chest, she whispered the same farewell she had repeated through countless lonely nights, though this time the words carried sorrow deeper than hope. "I'll wait for you tomorrow." 3 years passed before Duke Albert finally crossed the gates of Blackstone Castle again. Another campaign had ended in victory, another enemy banner had fallen, and another royal ceremony had celebrated his name. He returned expecting the familiar rhythm of the palace, believing everything he had left behind would still be waiting exactly as before. Instead, the silence that greeted him felt strangely unfamiliar. The servants bowed as always, but their smiles had disappeared. The entrance hall lacked fresh flowers, the fireplaces burned lower than usual, and the comforting scent of dinner no longer drifted through the corridors. Even the castle itself seemed to breathe more quietly. Albert dismissed the uneasy feeling and walked toward his study, where ministers immediately surrounded him with reports and requests. They discussed taxes, military supplies, and border disputes without mentioning Alexandra even once. Hours passed before he realized no one had announced his wife's arrival to welcome him. Irritated by the unusual absence rather than concerned, he left the meeting and crossed the palace toward their private chambers. The door stood half open. Inside, Alexandra carefully folded a simple blue dress before placing it into a travel trunk. The room looked different from the one he remembered. Shelves once decorated with porcelain figures now stood nearly empty. Expensive paintings had disappeared from the walls. The jewelry cabinet remained open, revealing only a single silver hairpin resting alone inside. She looked up and offered him a calm smile. "You're home," she said. "I am," Albert replied, noticing the packed luggage. "Are you traveling?" She nodded gently. "Tomorrow morning." He frowned. "Where?" "Somewhere peaceful." The answer puzzled him more than it alarmed him. "What about the palace?" "I've organized everything. The staff know their duties. The accounts are balanced. The schools and hospitals have enough funding for months. The duchy will continue without difficulty." Albert stared at her, waiting for an explanation that never came. Finally she met his eyes. "You don't have to worry anymore." The quiet certainty in her voice unsettled him. "I'm leaving, Albert." He searched her face for anger but found only exhaustion. "You'll come back after you've rested." She slowly shook her head. "I don't think I will." Without another word, she closed the travel trunk and walked past him, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender. Albert remained standing in the room, strangely convinced she simply needed time away from palace life. Pride whispered that she had always waited before. Surely she would wait again. The following morning, he rose later than usual. The carriage tracks outside the eastern gate had already disappeared beneath fresh rain. Alexandra was gone. The palace changed with startling speed. Breakfast arrived without the warmth that had once filled the dining room. Servants completed their work in silence instead of cheerful conversation. Even the gardens looked neglected despite careful maintenance, as though color itself had quietly departed with their mistress. Later that afternoon, Albert overheard two kitchen maids speaking in hushed voices. "I hope the Angel Duchess finds happiness." "So do I." Albert stopped walking. "The Angel Duchess?" The women froze, realizing he had heard them. One finally answered. "That's what the villages call her Grace." Confused, Albert questioned several servants, but each lowered their eyes before revealing small pieces of a life he had never noticed. They spoke of orphanages, hospitals, widows, schools, hungry families, and long journeys made beneath plain cloaks. Every story sounded impossible, yet every witness described the same quiet woman he believed had spent her days inside the palace. That evening he returned to Alexandra's sitting room searching for answers. Near the fireplace rested an old wooden chest. Its brass lock had been left open. Inside lay hundreds of neatly folded letters arranged with extraordinary care. The first began simply. "My dear Albert, today I learned your favorite tea grows cold more slowly if I keep the lid covered." He smiled faintly. The second described waiting beside another untouched dinner. The fifth spoke about wishing they might someday take a walk together through the gardens. The 10th admitted loneliness but insisted hope remained alive. The 20th confessed she had begun speaking to his portrait because silence answered more often than her husband. Albert continued reading until midnight. The letters slowly changed. Their cheerful observations became quiet prayers. Hope turned into patience. Patience softened into heartbreak. One letter described the famine and the children she refused to abandon. Another mentioned selling another necklace because warm bread mattered more than diamonds. Then his hands reached a letter stained by faded tears. "Today I learned we were going to become parents." His breathing stopped. The next pages described dreams of introducing their child to him. Then came another letter. "Today our little one left before meeting you." A small bundle slipped from between the pages. Tiny knitted baby shoes. Inside rested a folded note. "I thought you would hold these first." The shoes fell from Albert's trembling hands onto the floor. For the first time since boyhood, tears blurred his vision. Every victory he had celebrated suddenly felt hollow beside a child he had never known existed. His chest tightened with unbearable regret as he imagined Alexandra grieving completely alone while he accepted applause beneath royal banners. Still shaken, he opened the final compartment inside the chest. There he found ledgers recording every coin spent during the famine, every school rebuilt, every soldier paid, every orphan fed, and every widow sheltered. The signatures matched Alexandra's careful handwriting. His greatest military triumphs had depended upon supplies purchased with her inheritance, while the starving people he believed he had protected had survived because she sacrificed everything in silence. At the very bottom rested one final letter. Unlike every one before it, its closing line had changed. "I finally learned that loving someone also means letting them go." Albert clutched the letter against his heart as dawn light crept through the window, and for the first time in years he understood that the greatest battle of his life had only just begun. Before sunrise painted the eastern sky, Albert saddled his fastest horse without summoning an escort or announcing his departure. He carried no royal banners, no ceremonial armor, and no expectation of being welcomed. The wooden chest remained safely locked inside his study, but one letter rested inside his coat above his heart. It was the first one Alexandra had ever written, and every mile he traveled seemed to make its gentle words heavier. For the first time since becoming Duke, he rode not to conquer another enemy, but to seek forgiveness from the one person he had failed beyond measure. His journey led him through villages he had not visited since inheriting the duchy. Wherever he stopped, people recognized the black crest stitched onto his cloak and bowed respectfully, yet their admiration faded whenever Alexandra's name entered the conversation. An elderly woman running a modest bakery smiled sadly after learning whom he sought. "Your Grace," she said, placing warm bread into the hands of hungry children, "when my husband fell ill, it was your wife who bought his medicine. She never allowed us to thank her." Further along the road, a gray-haired blacksmith rested his hammer and wiped soot from his brow. "My grandson still walks because the Duchess paid for the surgeon after the accident. We prayed every night that heaven would bless her." At another village, children gathered around Albert's horse with innocent excitement. "Have you come to bring the angel Duchess home?" one little girl asked. Albert could only lower his eyes. Every conversation revealed another kindness he had never witnessed. Farmers spoke of debts quietly forgiven. Teachers remembered schools that remained open because anonymous donations always arrived before winter. Widows described baskets of food left outside their doors before dawn. Retired soldiers recalled sitting beside hospital beds while Alexandra patiently listened to stories nobody else cared to hear. Albert slowly understood that while he had defended borders with steel, Alexandra had protected the people within them through compassion. His victories had earned respect, but her kindness had earned love. As he continued searching, troubling rumors reached him from travelers passing in the opposite direction. Several suspicious riders had been seen following a lone carriage heading toward the northern forests. Albert's instinct sharpened immediately. Alexandra had intended to travel quietly, carrying little wealth, making robbery unlikely. Something felt deliberate. He urged his horse into a gallop. Hours later, smoke curled above the treetops. Albert raced toward it. The carriage lay shattered beside the road, flames consuming its wooden frame. Horses had broken free, guards lay motionless upon the ground, and broken arrows littered the muddy earth. He searched desperately through the wreckage, calling Alexandra's name again and again. There was no answer. Then he noticed something half buried beneath fallen leaves. A pale blue ribbon. The same ribbon Alexandra always used to tie her letters. Nearby, fresh hoofprints disappeared deeper into the forest. Albert followed them without hesitation. The trail stretched across rocky hills and narrow mountain paths where every delay allowed the kidnappers to travel farther. He questioned shepherds, hunters, and woodcutters until each clue pointed toward abandoned castle ruins overlooking the northern cliffs. The fortress had long been deserted, making it an ideal hiding place for men wishing to remain unseen. Night had fallen by the time Albert reached the crumbling walls. Voices echoed from inside. Peering through a broken window, he counted armed mercenaries guarding frightened villagers, several wealthy merchants awaiting ransom, and a cluster of terrified children huddled together beneath torn blankets. Among them sat Alexandra. Her wrists were bound, yet she ignored her own discomfort while comforting a crying little boy resting against her shoulder. She quietly divided the small piece of bread she had received among the children, pretending she had already eaten. Every frightened face turned toward her whenever fear threatened to overwhelm them. Even imprisoned, she remained the strongest person in the room. Albert's chest tightened. She had not changed. Only his understanding of her had. He slipped silently through a collapsed passage before confronting the nearest guard. Years of battlefield experience returned instantly. One mercenary fell before raising an alarm, but another shouted, sending armed men rushing from every direction. Steel clashed beneath broken archways as Albert fought through the narrow corridors, refusing to retreat despite overwhelming numbers. A blade sliced across his shoulder, another struck his side, yet he pressed forward until he reached the chamber holding the captives. One outlaw seized Alexandra, pressing a dagger against her throat. "Drop your sword," the man demanded. Albert slowly lowered the weapon. Before the kidnapper could react, Alexandra stamped sharply onto his foot and twisted away. The brief distraction gave Albert enough time to tackle the man aside. The struggle sent both crashing against weakened stone pillars. With a thunderous crack, part of the ceiling collapsed. Albert threw himself toward Alexandra just as heavy stones crashed downward. Dust filled the chamber. When silence returned, the surviving mercenaries fled into the darkness. Albert struggled to his knees, bleeding from several wounds but shielding Alexandra beneath his body. Around them, frightened children began crying again until Alexandra gently embraced them, reassuring each one that they were finally safe. Watching her comfort others before tending to herself, Albert realized kindness had never been something she chose only when life was easy. It was simply who she had always been. As dawn broke beyond the ruined walls, rescued families began the journey home under Albert's protection. Alexandra walked quietly beside him until they reached a hill overlooking the awakening valley. She finally looked at him with eyes carrying gratitude, sorrow, and caution in equal measure. "You came," she whispered. Albert swallowed the weight of every unread letter. "I should have come years ago." She offered a faint, weary smile before turning toward the road ahead. "I forgive you," she said softly. "But forgiveness and trust are not the same." Those words lingered between them as they continued walking, leaving Albert determined to prove that some promises could still be kept, even after arriving far too late. The journey back from the ruined fortress ended at a quiet country estate several days later, where Alexandra chose to remain instead of returning to Blackstone Castle. The modest house overlooked rolling meadows and a peaceful lake, far removed from courtly whispers and painful memories. Albert respected her decision without argument. He wanted desperately to bring her home, yet he finally understood that love could not be demanded after years of neglect. If trust had been broken over countless lonely tomorrows, it would have to be rebuilt one honest day at a time. He returned to the capital alone, carrying no illusion that a single rescue had erased the past. The letters remained beside him every evening, reminding him not only of Alexandra's patience but also of his own failures. Rather than burying those memories beneath work as he once would have, Albert allowed them to guide every decision he made. The corrupt ministers who had hidden Alexandra's sacrifices were dismissed and brought before the royal court. Their stolen wealth was recovered and returned to the villages they had exploited. Hospitals received permanent funding, orphanages expanded their doors, and schools welcomed children who had never before held a book. Albert visited each place himself, listening instead of commanding, learning instead of judging. The people noticed a change long before Alexandra did. They saw their duke helping farmers repair fences after storms instead of watching from horseback. They watched him carry supplies into hospitals bearing Alexandra's name. He attended memorial services for fallen soldiers and quietly comforted grieving families without expecting applause. Every act reflected lessons learned from the woman he had once overlooked. Slowly, respect transformed into genuine affection, not because Albert sought admiration, but because he finally understood that a ruler served his people rather than standing above them. Each night, after fulfilling his duties, Albert entered the small sitting room that had once belonged to Alexandra. The old wooden chest remained upon its familiar table, now accompanied by fresh parchment, ink, and a single candle. He opened one of her letters, read every word carefully, then wrote the reply she should have received years earlier. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he answered simple questions she had asked long ago about his favorite memories or childhood dreams. Sometimes he admitted fears he had hidden behind silence for most of his life. One reply became 2, then 20, then 100. Seasons changed while the stack continued growing until every one of Alexandra's 365 letters finally had an answer. When the last reply was finished, Albert tied the pages with pale blue ribbons matching the ones Alexandra had always used. At dawn he carried the bundle to the great oak tree overlooking the palace gardens, the quiet place where she had often sat writing while waiting for him to come home. Beneath its spreading branches he buried a polished wooden box containing every reply and placed a small silver key inside an envelope addressed only to her. He told no one what rested beneath the old tree. Months passed before Alexandra returned to the castle grounds. She came not because she had forgiven the palace, but because she wished to visit the gardens one final time before beginning a new chapter elsewhere. As she wandered beneath the familiar oak, she noticed disturbed earth and the tiny envelope tucked carefully between two roots. Curious, she unlocked the hidden box and found hundreds of neatly folded letters waiting inside. Her hands trembled as she opened the first. Each page carried Albert's handwriting. Each answered one of her forgotten questions. Each revealed regrets he had never spoken aloud. She remained beneath the tree until sunset, reading through tears that refused to stop. The final letter rested at the bottom of the box. You waited for me when I gave you every reason to stop. I cannot ask for those years back. I can only promise that however many days remain in my life, I will spend them proving your love was never wasted. If you never return, I will still be grateful for every letter you wrote. But if your heart leaves even the smallest door open, I will spend the rest of my life walking toward it. Unable to hold back her emotions, Alexandra followed the garden path toward the palace. No musicians greeted her. No grand ceremony had been arranged. Instead, the gates opened onto hundreds of villagers, soldiers, widows, servants, and children gathered among blooming white roses planted across the lawns. Together the flowers formed two simple words. Welcome home. An elderly woman stepped forward carrying a beautifully bound book. Inside were handwritten messages from people whose lives Alexandra had quietly changed over the years. Page after page thanked her for unseen kindness, unexpected hope, and compassion freely given. Overwhelmed, she realized that although she had often believed herself invisible, an entire duchy had remembered every gentle act. Albert walked slowly through the crowd and stopped before her. Without wearing his ceremonial sword or jeweled cloak, he looked less like a powerful duke than an ordinary man carrying extraordinary remorse. He lowered himself onto one knee. I spent years believing strength meant winning battles, he said. You taught me that true strength is choosing kindness when no one is watching. I cannot change the husband I was, but I promise never to become him again. If you will allow it, I would like to spend the rest of my life walking beside you instead of ahead of you. Alexandra looked around at the smiling faces surrounding them, then back at the man whose eyes finally held the warmth she had once searched for in vain. She gently took his hands and helped him stand. Then walk with me, she whispered. A year later the palace echoed with different sounds. Children's laughter filled the gardens, hospitals flourished, and every anniversary Albert read one of Alexandra's first letters aloud before placing it beside one of his replies. When they welcomed their daughter, they named her Hope, a reminder that even the longest silence could end when love found the courage to listen. And beneath the old oak tree, where two collections of letters had finally brought two hearts together, the kingdom discovered that its greatest victory had never been won on a battlefield, but inside a home where forgiveness was given the chance to bloom.